They say water remembers, and if that's true, then the lake behind my house holds every version of me in its depths. From the quiet mornings sitting back-to-back on a rowboat with my wife before the illness took her, to the countless hours fishing for bass with my son before he moved out west, and those thousands of moments I spent alone on the cedar dock just trying to wash the noise out of my head. Oak Hollow Lake wasn't just a geographic feature or a body of water on a map. It was history, it was breath, it was the last piece of my soul I had left after a lifetime of war and work. I moved here 15 years ago, right after I shook hands with the military and my career at the Corps of Engineers. Not many people think of civil engineering as combat work, but I spent half my life managing dams and reservoirs in places the news barely mentioned, holding back disasters that were always one rainstorm away from swallowing entire villages. When I bought this small stone house with the faded green shutters and the dock that curved gently into the water, I thought I was finally coming home to stillness. Back then, the Homeowners Association was as quiet as the lake itself. Just a few retirees making sure the grass didn't get too high or the mailbox color stayed uniform. They barely enforced a thing, which suited a man who just wanted to be left alone with his dog and a fishing rod just fine. The lake was technically community property, but since my lot bordered its widest section, I built a bench there with my own hands, cedar, sealed tight against the rain, and nobody minded. The water shimmered differently every season. Spring brought the frogs and dragonflies, summer the occasional slow-moving canoe, in the fall the mist rose off the surface like a memory waking from sleep, and winter was when it went dead still, glassy, like it was holding its breath to listen to the earth. But that stillness was shattered one morning in early April, when Scout, my dog, part shepherd, part mutt, and all heart, suddenly let out a low, vibrating growl at the waterline. Scout doesn't growl unless he smells something that doesn't belong to the natural order, and when I followed his gaze, my heart dropped into my stomach. The shoreline had pulled back, visibly, tangibly, cruelly. The water used to kiss the edge of the stone ledge where my dock began, but now it sat nearly 3 feet lower, exposing a swath of wet, stinking mud and tangled weeds that hadn't seen daylight in decades. At first, my engineer brain tried to explain it away. Maybe March was drier than I remembered. Maybe the runoff was slow. But when you live with the rhythm of a lake for 15 years, you know when it's a natural cycle and when it's an assault. Back at the house, I pulled the historical level charts I'd kept since the previous HOA president, Mr. Carlson, asked me to help identify some seepage issues years ago. I had mapped the water table trends across 4 years and even modeled evaporation loss for the driest seasons, and none of it, absolutely none of it, accounted for a drop this fast. Someone, somehow, was draining the lake. Later that afternoon, I walked over to the south bank near the overflow channel, and there it was, hidden behind some dense brush that most people wouldn't give a second look, a brand new steel pipe jutting out like a bleached bone from the bank. It was angled perfectly to divert water away from the retention basin and straight into a dry gully that bordered the far end of the neighborhood. The sloppy welds, the fresh trench scars in the dirt, it all screamed of a rush job. I took pictures, logged the GPS coordinates, and measured the flow rate with a handheld reader I still kept from my field days. Every number told the same story. Oak Hollow Lake was being bled out. The next day, I showed up at the HOA office with a thick file folder under my arm, fully expecting a misunderstanding or a clerical error. Linda, the new manager with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl, didn't even look up. She told me I needed an appointment, but I stood there like a stone wall until she finally picked up the phone. 5 minutes later, I was ushered into a small conference room where 3 board members sat with their arms folded like self-appointed judges. At the head of the table was Brad Whitmore, late 30s, a former tech sales guy turned self-appointed property czar. Ever since Brad got elected last year, he'd been obsessed with modernization, security cameras everywhere, drones to spot lawn violations, digitized fines, and power washing the sidewalks every 2 weeks whether they needed it or not. I laid out my photos, my flow calculations, and a brief summary of the hydrology. Someone installed an unauthorized pipe into the southern outlet, I said, keeping my voice level, and it's draining the lake. I expected concern, or at least a promise to investigate, but instead, Brad just chuckled, that smug, tech bro chuckle of a man who thinks he's the smartest person in any room. Are you serious, Mr. Hargrove? You think we're siphoning off the lake like some cartoon villain? He looked at the other board members, who offered back mocking nods. I looked him dead in the eye. I'm saying the water level dropped 3 feet in a week, and there's a pipe bleeding it into the gully. If you didn't authorize it, then someone is acting illegally. If you did authorize it, you're violating county watershed codes and Article 4 of this community's own covenants. The smirk wiped off his face the second I mentioned the law, but instead of a dialogue, he chose an attack. Do you have any idea how paranoid you sound? We've consulted experts on a water optimization project, and everything is under control. I stood up, gathering my papers, but leaving a copy on the table on purpose. I spent 20 years managing water in combat zones where mistakes meant people died. This lake is dying, and if you don't act now, you'll kill it out of pure arrogance. I left that office feeling the cold wall go up, but I knew the fight was just beginning. That night, I sat on my bench with Scout curled at my feet, the moon catching the surface in long silver lines, but it couldn't hide the scars of the fresh mud line or the dock legs that were now dangling in midair. I had seen rivers dry out from upstream manipulation. I had seen entire ecosystems collapse because engineers cut corners, but I never thought I'd see it in my own backyard. Not because of war or weather, but because of some men who thought their spreadsheets knew more than the land. The next HOA newsletter arrived a week later. Digitally, because paper was wasteful under Brad's new sustainability initiative. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through the PDF, and found it sandwiched between a paragraph about pressure washing the tennis courts and a photo of Brad posing next to a trimmed hedge. Water Optimization Project Phase 1 completed. The HOA has successfully improved lake drainage and erosion control on the southern shore. Residents can expect better mosquito mitigation and reduced flooding risks. My blood ran cold. Improved drainage? That's what they were calling it. I read on, my eyes scanning the text like a slow-motion car crash. They had plans for excavation, reshaping the shoreline, and water feature redesigns that would involve closing the trails. I set my coffee down hard enough to rattle the table, and Scout looked up, sensing the tension. They aren't just draining it, Scout. I whispered, they're gutting it. I marched out to the trail that hugged the perimeter, where the spring pollen was forming a thick film on the stagnant water. But now that pollen was clinging to dry mud banks, and the tadpole pools were being marooned in shallow puddles, their futures evaporating by the hour. Across the lake, I saw them, 3 men in neon vests with marking stakes, and a small bobcat parked on a trail. They were expanding the drainage. One of the workers waved at me, but I didn't wave back. Instead, I went home and pulled the community covenant documents from my study, 15 years old, filed neatly in a weathered binder. There it was, in black and white, Article 4, Common Areas and Environmental Protections. It stated clearly that any modifications to shared natural resources must receive an 80% homeowner vote approval at a public hearing. There had been no hearing, no vote, and no notice until the damage was done. I printed the pages, circled the language in red ink, and took it to the next HOA meeting. Brad stood at the head of the room with that same badge of superiority, while a handful of retirees and young couples sat in folding chairs. When it came time for resident comments, I stood up. I'd like to speak on the water optimization project. Brad sighed. Mr. Hargrove, we've already addressed, but I didn't stop. I have here Article 4 of the covenants, which requires a community vote for what you're doing. That never happened. A murmur rippled through the room. Brad's jaw twitched, and he leaned into the microphone, his voice turning ice cold. The board determined this qualifies as routine maintenance, which doesn't require a vote. I shot back. Routine maintenance doesn't involve excavation or re-engineering a shoreline to drop the water level by 3 feet. That's modification, Brad, and you know it. The whispers grew louder, and Mrs. Blandon, who usually kept to herself, leaned forward, listening intently. Brad had lost the room, and he knew it. He leaned in, his tone now a direct threat. Mr. Hargrove, your tone is bordering on hostile. If you continue disrupting these meetings, we will have to file a behavioral violation against you. There were audible gasps. It was a blatant attempt to silence dissent. I stared him down, not flinching for a second. File whatever you like, but I'm not going anywhere. This lake doesn't belong to you. It belongs to all of us. I left that meeting with the feeling of a target on my back. The next morning, a certified letter arrived in the mail. Violation notice, disruptive behavior. Fine, $250. I laughed out loud, a dry, hollow sound, and Scout barked in agreement. They were going to war with me over a lake? They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that in a box in my attic were military commendations for engineering under fire and sediment studies from 4 different continents. They thought I was just a grumpy old man with a dog and a bench, and that was going to be their biggest mistake. I didn't pay that fine, and I didn't hide either. In fact, I did the one thing men like Brad Whitmore fear most. I became a ghost in their machine. For the next 2 weeks, while the lake continued its slow, agonizing retreat, I went to work. I wasn't just some guy with a grievance anymore. I was a man back in the field. I wake up at 4 a.m. before the morning fog even thought about lifting, and I'd head down to the shoreline with a soil probe and a collection of glass vials. If they were going to claim this was maintenance, I was going to prove it was a massacre. But the HOA wasn't sitting idle. The retaliation didn't just come, it poured. It started with 2 uniformed contractors, not cops, but they had that same just following orders lack of eye lock, staking a bright orange sign into my front lawn while I was still holding my first cup of coffee. It read, "Notice, non-compliant landscaping. Violation pending review." I walked out barefoot, the morning dew stinging my toes, and looked at my yard. It was pristine. My hedges were clipped, my stone borders were aligned to the millimeter, and the mulch was fresh. This wasn't about grass. It was a brand, a scarlet letter meant to tell the neighbors, don't talk to the guy in lot 12. By noon, my mailbox was stuffed with 3 more violations. One for unauthorized distribution of printed materials because I dared to share the covenant facts with a few neighbors. Another for disruptive behavior, a repeat offense apparently, and a third for improper perimeter edging. Total fines, $750 due in 15 days, or they'd trigger a lien on my house. They were trying to bleed me dry, just like they were doing to the lake, but they forgot that I've lived in places where the authorities used much more than fines to keep people quiet, and I hadn't blinked then either. I shifted tactics. I started meeting with neighbors quietly, casually. No big groups, no disruptive meetings for Brad to spy on. I'd catch Mrs. DeMarco while she was getting her mail, or walk with Jorge while he was out with his spaniel. And that's when the real story of Oak Hollow under Brad's modernization started to leak out like toxic runoff. Mrs. DeMarco had been fined $300 for a fence color that was on the approved list, but Brad's digital color sensor said otherwise. Jorge's car had been towed from his own driveway because it sat for 3 days waiting on a battery, labeled as non-operational debris. One by one, these stories aligned. Different details, same underlying theme. Control. Pure, petty, power-drunk control. The lake, meanwhile, was becoming a graveyard. By late April, the cattails had turned a sickly yellow, and a thick, neon-green algae bloom began to crawl across the surface like a skin disease. The smell hit us next, a heavy, sour rot that smelled like wet leaves mixed with something metallic and dead. I saw joggers wearing masks. I saw kids being pulled away from the water's edge by frantic parents. And through it all, Brad sent out his digital water optimization updates, claiming everything was within expected seasonal variations, even citing a NOAA report about desert reservoirs in Arizona. Arizona. We're in the mid-Atlantic, for God's sake. But Brad knew most people wouldn't click the link. They'd just see the logo and trust the lie. Then came the fish. I'll never forget the sight of the first one. A big, bloated carp, belly up, drifting near my dock like a silver warning. Within 48 hours, there were dozens, then hundreds. The HOA sent out a crew of teenagers in orange vests to scoop them into black trash bags. But you can't scoop away the truth when it's rotting in the sun. I took my soil samples and the water data I'd collected, nitrogen levels through the roof, oxygen levels plummeting, and I prepared my final move. I didn't go back to the HOA office. I went to the State Environmental Protection Bureau. I sat in a lobby for 4 hours until a senior investigator named Elaine Turner finally saw me. I didn't give her a grumpy old man rant. I gave her a technical briefing. I laid out the satellite imagery, the flow rate calculations, the soil pH shifts, and the unauthorized pipe specs. I told her they are bypassing the retention protocols of a protected watershed, and they're doing it without a single permit on file. Elaine looked at my military ID, then at the data, and for the first time in months, I felt the tide start to turn. 2 weeks later, the white government SUV rolled into Oak Hollow. I watched from my porch as Elaine walked the trail, her heavy field boots sinking into the muck. She didn't look at the manicured hedges or the power wash sidewalks. She looked at the pipe. She looked at the dead fish. And she looked at the optimization signs with a look of pure, professional disgust. Brad tried to spin it, of course. He sent an emergency email saying a routine inspection was underway due to recent heavy rains, rain we hadn't seen in a month. But the panic was starting to show. He called an emergency town hall, but this time the room was different. It wasn't just me in the back. It was everyone. Mrs. DeMarco was there. Jorge was there. The Crawfords were there. A sea of people who had finally realized that when you let a bully take the lake, he eventually comes for your front porch, too. Brad stood at the podium, his voice cracking slightly through the microphone as he tried to blame misinformation and unstable individuals. He actually pointed at me and said, "This man has undermined the confidence of this board for his own personal vendetta." The room went silent, that heavy, thick silence that happens right before a storm breaks. I didn't even have to stand up. Mrs. DeMarco stood up first, then Jorge, then a young father from the north side whose kid had gotten a rash from the water. "We don't want to hear about him," Mrs. DeMarco shouted, her voice trembling but strong. "We want to know why you lied about the vote. We want to know why the lake is dead." Brad fumbled with his iPad, looking for a slide, a chart, anything to save him, but he found nothing. I saw Elaine Turner standing in the back corner, her arms crossed, just watching. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to witness the collapse. That night, for the first time in a year, I didn't feel like I was holding back the dam alone. The community had finally woken up to the smell of the rot. But Brad had one last card to play. The next morning, I found a legal notice taped to my door. Not a violation, but a lawsuit. The HOA was suing me for tortious interference and environmental trespassing, seeking $50,000 in damages. They thought they could bankrupt me into silence before the state could finish its report. They thought they could use the law as a bludgeon one last time. I looked at the paper, then I looked out at the lake, or what was left of it. I whistled for Scout, grabbed my car keys, and headed back to the city. If Brad wanted to play in a courtroom, I was more than happy to oblige, because I wasn't just bringing a lawyer. I was bringing the entire Department of Environmental Protection and 15 years of pin-up truth. The courtroom didn't feel like the ones you see on TV. There was no dramatic gavel slamming or lawyers pacing the floor with grand monologues, just the hum of an industrial air conditioner and a tired-looking judge named Miller who peered over his reading glasses like he'd seen every petty neighborhood squabble in the county. But this wasn't just a squabble. And the second the state attorney stood up next to Elaine Turner, the air in that room changed. It got thin, heavy, the kind of atmosphere that precedes a landslide. Brad was there, of course, sitting at the defense table with a high-priced lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Brad wasn't smirking anymore. He looked small, hunched over his legal pads, his tech bravado replaced by the frantic twitching of a man who realized his spreadsheets couldn't calculate his way out of a felony. The HOA's lawsuit against me was the first thing the judge addressed, and it lasted exactly 5 minutes. Judge Miller looked at the environmental trespassing charge, then at the evidence of the unauthorized pipe, and nearly laughed. "Case dismissed," he muttered, his voice echoing like a death knell for Brad's ego. "And if I see another frivolous filing from this board, I'll hold the individual members in contempt." Then the real trial began, the state versus Oak Hollow HOA. Elaine Turner didn't just testify. She performed an autopsy on the board's lies. She presented the subpoenaed invoices from Outsource Environmental, the landscaping company Brad had hired. One invoice, dated 2 weeks before the lake started dropping, was the smoking gun. It read, Install 6-inch steel outflow pipe at South Shore per President Whitmore's instruction. No permit required per client direction. Target volume, 15,000 gallons per day. The room went dead silent. It wasn't maintenance. It was a deliberate, calculated hit on a protected ecosystem just so Brad could reshape the shoreline for his modernization vision without having to ask the people who actually live there. When I took the stand, I didn't talk about engineering. I talked about history. I talked about the mornings with my wife, the fishing trips with my son, and the way a community is held together by the things it shares, the water, the air, the trust. I looked Brad right in the eye and said, "You didn't just drain the water. You drained the spirit of this neighborhood because you were too arrogant to believe that the land belongs to more than just the guy with the most power." The judgment was a hammer blow. Miller didn't just fine them. He gutted them. An $85,000 civil penalty to the state, a mandatory 12-month restoration project supervised by the DEP, not the HOA, and an immediate injunction to dismantle every inch of that pipe. But the real victory? The judge ordered a special election for the entire board within 45 days, effectively stripping Brad of his crown. The aftermath was like a slow-motion sunrise. Brad resigned 48 hours later and moved out of the neighborhood by the end of the month. His water optimization legacy reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at mailboxes. A young guy named Elijah, a tech-savvy kid who actually cared about the environment, ran for president on a platform of total transparency. He didn't promise modernization. He promised a stewardship zone. The lake didn't heal overnight. It took nearly 2 years of dredging, planting native marsh grasses, and waiting for the rains to forgive us. But I'll never forget the morning, about a year after the trial, when I was sitting on my newly rebuilt cedar bench. No graffiti, just the scent of fresh wood and lake mist. Scout was older now, his muzzle gray, but he suddenly stood up and let out a soft, happy yip. I looked out, and there, slicing through the surface like a silver blade, was a base, then another. The ripples started small, but they spread, reaching all the way to the docks of Mrs. DeMarco and Jorge and the Crawfords. We'd saved it. We'd actually saved it. Now, when I walk the trail, people don't look away anymore. We talk. We share coffee. We argue about the new budget, sure, but we do it in the light, where everyone can see. I kept a piece of that steel pipe in my garage, a rusted, jagged reminder of what happens when good people stay quiet because they're afraid of a $250 fine. It's my Oak Hollow Provision trophy. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. For every Oak Hollow, there are 1,000 other neighborhoods where the Brads of the world are still winning, where people are losing their homes, their peace, and their natural heritage to petty tyrants with a gavel and a grievance. So, I have to ask you, was I right to go nuclear on my own HOA? Or did I just trade one kind of conflict for another? Have you ever had to stand up to a czar in your own backyard? Or are you still sitting on your porch, watching the water recede and hoping someone else will find the pipe? Drop your experiences in the comments. Tell me if your HOA is a community or a cult, because the only way we keep the brays out of the garden is by reminding them that we're all watching the waterline together. Like, subscribe, and remember, the water always remembers, and so should you. Would you like me to adjust any specific tone or expand on a particular scene before we wrap?